Okay, it looks like our attendees are stabilizing. Might get started. So once again, welcome. Thank you very much for joining. And now it's Friday, it's lunchtime, and everyone's looking forward to the weekend. So yeah, very happy that you guys made the time to come in. So we've had a number of webinars up to this point, and it seems like Scope 3 is a topic where people would like to have a bit more material to look into. So today we thought we'd do a specialized webinar where we focus specifically on Scope 3 downstream emissions, which is kind of the evil twin of the upstream emissions because they're not less important at all, but they do receive a lot less attention. And so I thought we should go through the concepts of Scope 3 downstream today. We won't be able to cover everything because it is a very complex field. There's again a lot of steps that can be automated. There's a lot of technology hooks where you can be supported, but nevertheless, it does require a certain amount of overview to know which direction to go in. So let's dive into it and see how deep we can go in this session, and then also we have a few avenues for going forward after this session in terms of where we can focus on specific Scope 3 downstream channels that we want to look into maybe in a bit more detail. So that's me. My name is Arne Geschke. I'm co-founder and the Chief Data Officer here at Fair Supply. I've worked in supply chains for coming up to almost 20 years now. I was an academic at the University of Sydney for a long time, did a lot of research in environmental impact assessment, how global supply chain frameworks are actually built, how the mathematical tools that we're missing to do this at a global scale. And one of the very popular applications of this kind of research and this entire research field was environmental assessment, and specifically carbon accounting, which was the first cab off the rank for supply chain assessments. So it was a very natural step to move towards Fair Supply when I co-founded this company. We started off looking at modern slavery in supply chains. There was a lot of regulatory tailwind at the time, and then of course moved very quickly into Scope 3, which now is receiving a very significant regulatory tailwind as well. And that's sort of where I came from. My job here at Fair Supply is still to make sure that the data engine under the hood keeps running smoothly, and I'm extending data sets towards other emissions, towards other supply chain risks that are becoming more and more prevalent now. So we're moving much more towards a supply chain intelligence platform now. And one of the most important parts is Scope 3. So Scope 3 is very closely tied to supply chains and the effects and the environmental effects in supply chains. So just a quick agenda. Hang on. I love it that we have a first typo in the first bullet point. It's not Scope 3 streaming, it's screening, of course. So we want to understand, again, the steps of where do we actually start with Scope 3? How do we get there? How do we get to Scope 3 downstream emissions? And then we want to understand the categories a bit more. There's a bit more nuances in the Scope 3 downstream categories than for upstream, in my opinion. And then we're going to take you through a step-by-step framework. And I also have an example that I prepared just to give you an idea what the thinking process is going forward. And we've got a disclaimer, obviously, around what we can and cannot deliver in these webinars. Just assume you've all read this. So let's have a quick look. So if you have worked in carbon accounting in any capacity, you will have probably seen this image more than enough. And I'm sorry about that we bring it up again, but it is the starting point for all emissions accounting. So I'm going to go through it very quickly, but just to get us all on the same page. So in my opinion, or in my experience, the reason why the emissions were split into the Scope 1, 2, and 3 categories is probably coming from an intuitive viewpoint. Scope 1 emissions are very intuitive. It's those emissions that are actually within the boundaries and the control of the reporting company. For me, Scope 2 is kind of the first and only value chain emission that has a similar level of intuition around it. Understanding how much does the power station emit when it burns the coal to produce my electricity is something that is quite easy to get your head around. Everything else, the entire value chain, upstream, downstream, is all bucketed into scope 3. Scope 3 upstream and downstream have slightly different, well, they're of course like different in the way of what questions they're trying to answer, but I feel like scope 3 upstream is a lot more, there's a lot more talk about scope 3 upstream solutions for that. Scope 3 downstream is probably a bit more elusive, and that's why I think it's important that we talk about that today. We're going to dive into it a little bit as we move forward, but there's actually lots of similarities between upstream and downstream. We can adopt a lot of the ideas from the upstream work for our downstream tasks. So I summarized this in these 4 points. There's probably at least twice as many points you could add to the bottom of this list. But if we go through it step by step and we try to transport the concepts of upstream to downstream, we can see that there's actually quite a lot of similarities, a lot of ideas that we can carry over, which make our life a bit easier. So I think the maturity is an important one. Upstream is a very established concept. There's also other language that we use around that are quite mainstream. So things like carbon footprint often refers to the upstream exposure of carbon. When you, for example, go into a supermarket, you can sometimes have products that say, oh, the carbon footprint of this product is so many kilos of CO2 or grams of CO2. We meet this concept of upstream emissions a lot more often. Like, what are my supply chains is a much more intuitive thing to go to than what are my downstream value chains. So if I, especially as a person who is like in our private life, we're all in a sense private or end consumers of products. We do not buy products to sell them on or to incorporate them in a production process to sell them on. We get confronted with the concept of upstream supply chains and as such upstream emissions all the time. And I think this comfort we've developed around upstream emissions has also been carried forward into upstream reporting in our daily jobs and our job lives. So it's very established. There's lots of terms that are thrown around. You've probably all heard about spend-based emissions factors. You've heard about products and services, purchase products and services, purchase capital goods. Those are ideas that are very, very familiar. So we have a lot less established concepts and a much lower awareness for the scope 3 downstream component. When you think about it, especially for companies that are more in the primary and secondary sectors, the downstream revenue chains and the downstream emissions are actually nowhere near like less important than the upstream concepts, especially if, say, products are sold that have a very intensive lifetime. For example, if a car company sells a conventional petrol car, this car might run for like 200, 300,000 kilometers in some cases. So there's a lot of energy and emissions that are enabled through that sale. So it's by no means insignificant to look at these downstream effects. And those profiles, those emissions profiles where there's a significant component in the downstream activities is something that we see, especially in primary industry. So it's mining, agriculture, forestry, fishing. Those kinds of primary industries often have very significant downstream effects because they are at the beginning of a production chain, which at each stage requires some sort of emissions impact in order to be able to develop its own component in the value chain. But then there's also a lot like less vocabulary we can use. So I've used it before here in even in this talk. The term supply chains is something we're all very familiar with, but is there actually a proper word for the downstream equivalent? So we use the term revenue chain because the starting point, supply and sales, like is very similar in terms of money goes out, money comes in. So the revenue chain is in my understanding, or that's how I explain it to myself, is the downstream component of the entire value chain. So upstream is supply chains, downstream is revenue chains, all together is the entire value chain. But even there we don't have a mainstreamed sort of vocabulary set that we can use. Let's dive down to intuitiveness. So it's much more intuitive, I think, because we're used to it, to go upstream. It's supplier driven. Of course, I buy a car, there's a whole heap of production processes to make that car. There's a whole heap of secondary production processes, like the steel has to be made and the tires have to be produced, otherwise the car can't be built, that we are quite familiar with. And the greenhouse gas protocol, I think, reflects that intuition. It reflects the comfort that we have. There's purchase goods and services, there's capital goods, and there's transport services, very intuitive. There's a few probably less intuitive, like why is employee commuting part of upstream and not? So those kinds of things one can discuss, but the bulk is quite intuitive. Whereas for downstream, there's a few categories where we have to think about a little bit. So, for example, investments in franchises. Why are investments downstream? I personally think, well, one could argue it doesn't have to be at downstream, but that's where they landed in the greenhouse gas protocol. But how does that mean? Because if I'm a company that sells something, I'm not actually, like, me selling something doesn't actually affect at all what investment decisions my company might make. So how does that all fit together? Those are the thinking processes we come across the first time when we go into downstream assessments. Same with franchises. Big franchise company would, for example, be McDonald's. The Scope 3 assessment of McDonald's would actually incorporate all their franchise restaurants around the world. But what does it actually look like? How much access does the headquarter have to all these different individual restaurants around the world? Those are questions that are a lot less comfortable than the upstream concepts that we're used to. The methodology. When you start out in Scope 3, first of all, it is death by 1,000 paper cuts. There's, in many large companies, we have thousands, if not tens of thousands of suppliers that we need to deal with. And that is just the purchase goods and services. There are lots of other concepts that we need to understand, lots of other business activities that flow into the upstream assessment, but often suppliers is the starting point, and it's the bulk of the emissions. So even then, if you've worked in upstream assessments, maybe you've engaged an external company to do that for you, it's a very labor-intensive concept. And often the spend-based methodology is the first step for the screening process of your emissions to establish materiality thresholds and define focus points where the Scope 3 assessment will be carried out in more detail. And so the spend-based components, like spend-based emissions factors, spend-based assessments, are all components that are cited in the greenhouse gas protocol. There's also a wealth of data points that can be used for that. So you can download spend-based emissions factors from say the EPA in North America. You only get one set, and that doesn't actually cover each country of the world, but there's something you can work with. Here at Fair Supply, a large component of our engine works on a spend-based methodology. It's quite intuitive, and in some ways, the greenhouse gas protocol also says if you meet certain criteria, the spend-based methodology can actually be used to fully report on your emissions. So it can be used for the inventory in some categories if certain criteria are met. So it's a very, in a way, easy starting point. It's still a lot of work, but it's an intuitive starting point, because if there's one thing that companies keep an eye on, is where the money goes. So that helps us. There's no real equivalent in downstream. The spend-based methodology obviously doesn't apply for downstream emissions unless you have like isolated cases where you might be paying for the transport of your shipped goods. But in general, there's no unified starting point for downstream assessments. The greenhouse gas protocol is quite vague where it comes for how to start. It says, okay, so input-output frameworks, which are also used to develop spend-based emissions factors, they can be used for an initial screening process, but that's where it stops. It's fairly hands-off in terms of giving hints of how that can be done. And there are, in fact, there's no data offering that would sort of mirror what's happening for upstream in terms of, hey, these are revenue-based downstream Scope 3 factors that you can use to understand what's going on. And so there's no universal equivalent. So we are offering one, and I'm going to talk you through this. But there's no guidelines in terms of hard guidelines where to start with Scope 3 downstream emissions. And the calculation methods are, in my opinion, also much more prescriptive for the upstream. I think there's a lot more room for interpretation for downstream, and I'll show you a few interpretations later on. And so there's a lot less, if you summarize it, there's a lot less kind of direction for downstream emissions. And at the same time, some of the biggest companies here in Australia, especially mining, mining, agriculture, also to some extent manufacturing, or livestock, are companies that that do need tools, reliable, fast to use tools, to make or to be able to carry out proper downstream assessments, because it is a significant component of their value chain emissions. So downstream, screening downstream, how do we start? The Greenhouse Gas Protocol recommends always screen for your emissions first, and then from that point, make a call on your materiality threshold. So in terms of like which part of my downstream emissions, let's just focus on downstream here, which component of my downstream exposure is worth digging into and which is not. And that's this prioritization process is very, very important for any kind of emissions reporting. And the reason for that is I always try to take a step back from at this point. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because we are trying to avoid a significant shift in the global climate landscape. And a significant shift will not just affect us as people, will also affect how our companies operate, how the entire planet operates. So we want to reduce something. We're not going to be able to actually shift the dial if we don't know where to start. We're not going to be able to shift the dial if we spend 6 months on our Scope 3 emissions inventory and get it down to like the 5th decimal. We get it right. That's not what we're doing. This exercise, this entire Scope 3 reporting thing is essentially part of a much bigger picture to have a significant shift in how we affect our climate around the world. And for this, screening is massively important, because if you understand where in your value chain the big exposure profiles are, then you know where you can work on it. Then you can direct your resources towards mitigating those emissions at a very early point. So an efficient, fast screening process is very complex, but it's very vital to have a really impactful emissions journey and ESG journey in general in the company. And in our last webinar, when we talked about upstream screening, we focused on that quite a lot, because we have to have an efficient screening process to then say, okay, we can actually disregard 90% of our suppliers because only 10% of our suppliers hold the bulk of our emissions exposure. And for downstream, it's very, very similar, but there's no universal method for it. So we want to screen, but there's no one says, do it this way. So there's actually very powerful ways of doing it, but the Greenhouse Gas Protocol stays quite vague when it comes to that. The problem, bottom left here, is the spent data doesn't work. The spent data approach doesn't work. But the good news is that you can actually flip the thinking. You can flip the thinking of the upstream screening on its head, and then there's a very elegant way to start with the screening process and not let it take too much time, so we can actually focus on what's important, and that's to understand where we can reduce emissions efficiently. Oop, that was one too far. Okay, so let's say I assume we probably have lots of people on this call that have worked in Scope 3 upstream concepts. Maybe some of you even visited our upstream webinars. Let's look at how we're thinking in upstream concepts and see if we can translate that thinking to downstream. And maybe that's going to give us a good starting point. So our entry point for Scope 3 screening is spent data. That's our starting point. So in downstream, let's use the revenue data as a starting point, because revenue data tells us where our goods go and how much value it creates further down the value chain. So the data sources that are used for the screening usually come from global supply chain databases. And these global supply chain databases are, first of all, money databases. So global supply chain databases follow certain guidelines in terms of the shape and form that the numbers must have in these databases. But essentially, what these data, at the purest form, what these databases hold is a financial relationship between two sectors that trade with one another. And this financial relationship is reflected in absolute dollars that these two sectors exchanged in 1 year. And the guidelines, how these numbers are generated or how they're collated and accounted for, they're all written down in the United Nations System of National Accounts. And all the individual data, the individual statistical agencies around the world, they compile data sets according to the same standards. And because they're all compiled according to the same standards, we can pull them all together and reinterpret them as a global supply chain database. And then they are overlaid with emissions data. And then there's an understanding of what the interdependencies are in the economy and what emissions occur at each node of the supply chains. And that all sounds really complicated, probably. But what spend-based emissions factors are essentially is the end product of this process. And the spend-based emissions factors have a fantastic property. They translate dollars into emissions across the entire supply chain. And that is so powerful that they are very, very popular in the screening process. But what is often hidden is that these global supply chain databases that are actually used to generate these spend-based emissions factors, they can be flipped on their head. They don't have to be interpreted for upstream supply chains only. They can actually be flipped on the head, and they can be reinterpreted to understand what happens if I sell $100 million worth of black coal into the market. What economic activity is actually enabled? What revenue chains or what economic activity can happen because I was able to inject that amount of value into the value chain. And this flip can again be paired with emissions data, and then we can do a revenue-based downstream screening. So I can then understand, okay, the selling of my coal will cause like a certain amount of emissions from the combustion of the coal, but the combustion of the coal might generate electricity, and this electricity is then used in further production processes which carry further emissions, and they produce goods which then carry further emissions as they are used. And those kind of relationships are the one-to-one translation of a supply chain assessment, but they give us exactly what we want. They translate our revenue into downstream emissions. And that's the screening coverage. Next line here. Spend-based method offer access to the majority of upstream categories. We don't get quite that far. We can't cover most of the downstream categories. That's because downstream is more of a mixed bag, but these revenue-based methods can actually help to screen most of the downstream categories. And so we have the starting point that we want. The data modeling is a little bit slightly different. So for data modeling, we have the spend data as the starting point, and we have two ways of getting there for the downstream assessment. The first one is the equivalent concept where we say, give me your revenue data, and the revenue data tells me which revenue chains are actually used. But sometimes we can't get there. Sometimes we only have the spend data. But there are ways using national accounting data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics to model what the revenue data look like from the spend data. It's obviously it's a modeling result, so it's not real company data. But again, for the screening downstream emissions, that's sufficient at this point. I'm having a very hard time looking at the Zoom chat while I'm talking. I might just take a few minutes because this was a lot of nerd talk, and just see if any questions have popped up, and also give you maybe some time to relax your brain for a few seconds. Okay. Let's just see if I find my screen. Cool. So what does this look like? If you came to our upstream webinar, you would have seen a very, very similar picture, but the other way around. So so the upstream picture has the customer at the bottom of the screen as the supply chains upwards. So it's a very comfortable, or it's a very we're quite familiar with that concept of upstream supply chains. Downstream revenue chains are not that different, but we're not used to what they look. So I gave a few examples in this plot here to give you an idea. Let's look at the one on the left-hand side first. The customer is the reporting entity. That's the person who wants to run the Scope 3 downstream assessment. So if we look at the first revenue chain at the very right-hand side, that's us. So the reporting entity sells their products directly to the households, and the downstream revenue chain, I called it supply chain here, the downstream revenue chain ends. And the reason is, this is a concept that upstream doesn't have. The reason is that there's no further processing of that good or service that needs to happen. It doesn't enter the economic cycle anymore. It just ends. So virtually every item in the room that I'm sitting in falls in that category, apart from maybe my work laptop, because that is part of the inputs that are required for me to do my job. But the guitar I've got here, my loudspeaker that I sometimes listen to music to when I code, that kind of stuff is exactly that category. I bought that from a company, and the economic journey of that product ends with me as the final consumer. The other ones, the other value chains, they are a bit more complex. So that is, for example, especially for primary industries, it's very important. So if you imagine a coal miner, a coal mining company would sell the coal to a steel manufacturer, for example. The coal then gets used in the blast furnace and enables the production of steel. The steel then gets sold on to produce a car. The car is, or a truck. The truck is sold on to a transport company, and this transport company is responsible for shipping certain goods for the lifetime of the truck. There's a lot of emissions, a lot of activity that is enabled through the sale of the coal, and that's why why it's important to understand the downstream supply chains. I've got a question here, I believe. Oh, okay, Brian. Okay, so I was wondering whether I can get around this question or not. This is going to get a bit nerdy now. So how can you model revenue from spend? That is something where we have to zoom out. So if you look at the system of national accounts and the way the Australian Bureau of Statistics compiles the national accounting data for the Australian economy, they are on a sector-based level. That means they do not model individual companies for confidentiality reasons. They look at the economy from a sector-based approach. So if you want to understand, if you have a company where you have spend data, then you can align this company to all the sectors that the company operates in, and you can understand if the spend profile of this company behaves similar to the majority of the sectors that this company operates in. And from that information, you can then look at, okay, so the Australian Bureau of Statistics and have the information, the spend profile of this sector looks like this, and the revenue profile of the same sector looks like this. And so from the information you have from the reporting company, what their spend profile looks like, you can then model out using the ABS information what the likely revenue profile will look like in order for that company to be able to actually support that spend. And that's then the starting point for downstream emissions. So you're essentially predicting what a company operating in that sector would have to what the revenue stream would have to look like in order for them to be able to support the spend that is being assessed. And that's how it can be modeled. It's always, and I want to say that explicitly, it is always better to work with direct data, always. But we sometimes don't have direct data, we don't have direct revenue data, but it's still important to get an understanding of downstream emissions, especially for companies where maybe downstream emissions are not so relevant because they, for example, service companies such as Pacify, myself, service companies have often a lot more exposure in their upstream emissions than in their downstream. It's important to maybe run a high-level screening just to make sure that that is actually the case, and the materiality assessment has shown that there's not that much effort required to understand the downstream emissions. For those kinds of applications, that a modeling exercise to estimate the downstream revenue profile is very, very helpful. Let's see, another question. In the coal mining context, Rashid, this is probably outside the scope of this webinar. I'm not a coal mining expert. My expertise is Scope 3 accounting. I think this is more of a consulting piece for a coal mining company. It's probably sitting outside of this webinar. but I would love to continue the conversation after this. And Oli, Pelek, your question, how we reduce emissions using low-tech solutions, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. You mean going away from maybe you can elaborate a bit on that and I can answer it later if I can. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So let's look at the categories. So we paired them into two different categories. The first one, 9, 10, 11, 12, so downstream of transportation, distribution, processing of sold products, use of sold products, end of life treatment of sold products. Those are all categories that are closely linked to revenue chains. This is all happening in revenue chains. If you sell a product, it's being processed, there's emissions happening, that's category 10. If you sell a product and somebody has to pay for the shipping, that's category 9. So those are all like revenue type allocations. And that's where the screening method is really powerful. There's 3 other categories that sit outside of that. And I think it's really interesting thinking exercise that I want to take you through why a revenue-based screening doesn't work here. Let's take, for example, investments. Say we have a large company that has services and products that it sells, but it also has investment activities. There's virtually no, maybe take a bank. Like a bank sells a number of services to its customers, like the annual fee you pay on your mortgage, for example, on your mortgage package, not the interest, the actual fee, whatever it is, like $100 and something that you pay each year for the package that you have, account fees that you might have, other services that you might buy for a bank. That's a revenue stream for the bank. But the revenue stream of the bank does not give us any information on what investments the bank makes. And also the spend data of the bank, the operational spend data, has no link to what investments the bank makes. So there's virtually no connection between spend and revenue data that would give us any idea what investments, what in scope 3 exposure investments carry. It's the same for franchises. That's the McDonald's example again. The operational expenditure of the headquarters of a company give us no information, or the revenue data give us no information on how the individual restaurants operate. And I want to point this out, same with leased assets, I'm not going to go to detail there, but I want to point this out because it's really important to understand what data is required. And in fact, an investment and a franchise assessment is essentially an assessment in itself. And we've done that a lot here at Fair Supply when we work with, say, institutional investors. They scan each individual investment portfolio for their financed emissions. There's different rules around how financed emissions are assessed. There's guidelines that sit on top of the greenhouse gas protocol that make the step between what the greenhouse gas protocol defines and the investment case. There's a whole different beast. And that's why a downstream assessment can be a bit more complex than an upstream assessment. We're actually planning, it's at the end of this webinar, we're actually planning an investment webinar. So where we just look at scope 3 investment emissions, and that's in a few weeks' time. We just want to focus on this specific case. So for now, let's return to categories 9 and 12 to see how we can do this. And this is where it gets tricky. This is where screening is like, it's really powerful, because I got this from the technical guidance for this greenhouse gas for the GHG protocol for scope 3. I wanted to tell you, show you kind of where technology can help, because there's lots of sort of decision tree situations in the greenhouse gas protocol where they say, if you're paying for this, then it sits in scope 1. If someone else is paying for this, it sits in scope 3, those kinds of things. And this is one of them. So the question is how to account for scope 3 emissions from transportation, distribution of sold products. So you are a company, say, you are a company, I don't know, maybe a window manufacturer here in Sydney. I got new windows a few months ago and they shipped them here, like with their own trucks. So so they paid for I didn't have to pay for the delivery of the windows, I did it themselves. So if the company, they're actually the second case, but if the company does not pay for the transportation of the sold products to the retailer, and then the reporting company does not include the emissions from transportation in its own scope 1 and 3, it puts the transportation of sold products into category 9, which is downstream transport. So if the company doesn't pay for it, then it sits in their downstream transport. So if you buy something off the internet and you have to pay a few dollars extra for shipping, then the company you're buying from has to put those downstream emissions into their downstream transport emissions. If shipping is included, that means the company pays for the transportation. They have to put it in their upstream emissions. And then the retailer in both cases sits in category 9. So that's yeah. So there's lots of if-then, decision tree type situations in the greenhouse gas protocol, and all of this is much better supported if you have that embedded in the text solution, and that's the space we're working in, because there's almost no point going through this like line by line. It's much better to have a text solution that takes it off you. In this case, just as a side comment, this is actually a case where spend data, again, informs you for the screening process what you should assess, because you can see on the balance sheet, was there revenue taken, or was there money coming in for the transportation of the products or not? And then we can make that assessment. I'm going to go for a few more slides and then return to the questions, so there's not that much of a gap in between. So I wanted to focus on one specific use case here, or one specific example. I'm just realizing now how complex this topic is. I thought my slides were nice and streamlined, but now I realize that there's like lots of different details I'm already mentioning now. So I want to take you through the process of a downstream of processing of sold products, probably one of the most important categories for downstream, similar to the upstream counterpart of purchase of sold of goods and services. So the first box on the left, that is what the screening process tells you. So that is like the fully automated revenue type screening process. It says, does the processing of sold products contribute significantly to Scope 3 emissions based on screening, or is engagement with the customer otherwise relevant to the business goals? I was asked today, are there guidelines to answer this question? There's not. There's a few guidelines. They're pretty wishy-washy in the greenhouse gas protocol. But the question, what is important for you? What is material for you? That's an answer that you need to answer for yourself, and you need to document when that is the case. We can help with that as people that work in this space, if you're working with us. But essentially, it's down to the responsible person in the company to say, our threshold sits here. This is what we consider material, and this is why. And from this opinion onwards, this is how we're going to operate. So say we made that distinction here, and we say, yes. Next question. Can customers provide energy or greenhouse gas data related to processing of sold intermediate products? Yes or no? Most likely the answer is no in most cases. I've seen it only very rarely that companies can say, hey, I bought so many thousands of dollars of goods from you, I processed them, and the emissions belonging to the processing of what I bought from you are this. That's a very rare case. Often there's a mix of different things, different inputs are combined into a new product. This entire process takes energy. I have an example in a second. It's very hard often to get that. If there is a way to get that information, use the site-specific method. Really labor-intensive, knuckle-down type situation. If not, use the average data method. So that's what I'm going to show you. I'm using the average data method. And again, average data method, again, has a number of decisions you have to make along the way. But one important thing to point out, as you will see, in this decision tree, there's no option for a spend-based method. So there's either the average data method or there's the site-specific method. For upstream, we often have then the option to have a spend-based method. But this is often not, there's never, I haven't seen it like that. It's just not a case. It's not a part of the downstream journey. So that's why there's no common starting point for the downstream screening. So use average data method. Let's dive in. Then we have category 11, use of sold products. I find this one a bit confusing again. The use of sold products, when is a product used? When is it processed? So I'm using my computer, but the computer that I'm using here is also a business expense from Fair Supply that I need in order to deliver this webinar. So in a way, the computer is part of the overall the overall business activities of fair supply. And it's the same with some products that we sell. And I had a very interesting read a few years ago of a very large mining company in Australia. They published their emissions statement, and I looked at it for 2 subsequent years. And in 1 year, they considered the coal that they sold as category 11, use of salt products. And their argument was, when you burn the coal, its life ends, so it was used. And therefore, the emissions coming from the combustion of the coal should go into category 11. One can argue that way. And then the next year, they put it into category 10, because they said, actually, it's not use of salt products, it's processing of salt products. And the reason is that the coal is just part of the further journey of the production process. The coal itself obviously doesn't exist anymore once it's combusted. But it does enable further production processes. So it's part of a bigger picture of processing of salt products. So you can already see there's a lot of stuff that where interpretation is important. So you can see here, the direct use phase emissions is automobiles, aircraft, engines, motors, and then there's an indirect use phase at the bottom, which is things that don't by themselves require cause emissions, but they need looking after. So the example here is apparel and food, pots and pans. So the pot, when you buy a pot, that thing doesn't cause any emissions, but when you put it on the stove, of course it uses emissions. So it's starting to become a little bit gray, what category you're working in. Yeah, David, that's a really interesting question that you asked. So for those that are in the chat, please leave David Robert's question. That's a really interesting question, because you have very little control over the use of the salt products. And this is almost like a philosophical question, because we are not like, we don't live in a world where we have product stewardship. We live in a world where we have product ownership. So our goal is to sell a certain product or service, and we're so far not incentivized to ensure that the use phase of the product fulfills a certain has a certain emissions profile. I think maybe we might be moving into that time, but you're right. It's very hard. It's very hard for a company like yours when you have an IT product distribution company. You just like literally have no control over what's happening to that. Yeah, that's very interesting case. It's almost like we need a complete paradigm shift where we say there's a reward for companies to sell products that can be operated at a lower energy rate in order to reduce emissions downstream. But that's a very hard one to control. You have a bit more control upstream, because you can say to your suppliers, hey guys, you guys popped up as my supplier with high emissions profile. I've got options. I can change suppliers, but I would also like to work with you to decarbonize your production processes so we all get to the same goal. That's a much harder thing to do downstream. So I think in the overall journey, we are at the reporting. We're at the point where we're understanding this. I don't think we're at the point yet where this downstream concept is actually has developed the momentum to solve those questions that you just put into the chat. Yeah, very, very interesting situation. So then we have end of life, and I just want to step through this quickly. So end of life is when the product comes to its end. And you can see again that the greenhouse gas protocol actually quite simplifies that. So there's landfill, incineration, and recycling. Of course, there's lots of things that can happen when the product gets to the end of its life. It might deteriorate, it might change shape. Things can change. Also, questions like, what is actually the end of life of steel? That's a very interesting question, I think. And the greenhouse gas protocol is quite vague when it comes to downstream. Those ones we talked about. I don't want to talk too much about it. These are essentially all their own assessments. You need to go into your investment portfolio and say, what are we investing into? How do we account for the emissions? I have to talk to all my franchises, say, what are you doing? How do you cook in a restaurant? What gas do you use? Are you using electricity or gas? And so the story goes on. So there's a lot of room where we still need to provide, also companies such as ourselves, where we need to provide solutions that make this journey a lot easier. So because I don't want to run out of time, this is a really simple example. And for those on the call that are working in mining, I would like to beg for forgiveness that I'm showing a very, very simplistic way of making steel here. But it's just for the purposes of the demonstration. I hope that is sufficient. So what does it look like when you start on your process? The first thing to know is like, you don't have to be perfect from day one. It's not a drama if you're not, because the legislation is slowly rolling out, but it makes sense to start early. But once you've got the engine running in terms of scope 3 understanding, it becomes easier, it becomes faster, it becomes cheaper, obviously. And then you can have the necessary insights to actually make a change. So it's essentially 5 steps. You always start with the screening. You have lots and lots of data you need to understand. The screening process helps you prioritize where you should put your efforts. That's like getting the screening step right makes life so much easier. Second thing, that's an internal problem or internal question in the company. What is my materiality threshold? Do I want to assess the top 10% of my carbon exposure? Do I want to assess the top 10% of my expenditure? Do I have a certain interest that is aligned with the company values to maybe ensure certain effects in the workforce? That's the kind of stuff that needs to be discussed. Then, step 3, back to the greenhouse gas protocol. Now I know what my materiality threshold is. Decide on my calculation methods, collect the data, run the calculations. What are my learnings? Do it better next year. Do it faster next year. That's the kind of stuff. That's how it works usually. So again, this is like, I'm very sorry, but this is very simplistic, okay? This is so let's say a company sells iron ore and another company sells coal. There's no coal underneath it on the right-hand side here. I'm sorry about that. Iron ore and coal are sold to a steel company to produce steel. And you can now argue like the example I said before, the iron ore company could say, we actually don't have any downstream emissions because the iron ore doesn't get burned. And all the emissions, all the downstream emissions sit with the with the coal company. That's not necessarily the right way, because if it wasn't for the emissions, the iron ore wouldn't go anywhere. So how can we get there? So first of all, let's done screening. This is from our tool here at Fair Supply. I ran screening for again, very average tonnages, very average prices and stuff. So I said for a million tons of coal, which cost $100 million US, and 1.6 million tons of iron ore, which cost $300 million US. What is the associated emissions? From a purely revenue-based, I've got the revenue numbers here, from a revenue-based screening perspective, so push of a button, what our tool delivered was 425 kilotons of CO2e downstream belonging to coal and 245 kilotons belonging to iron ore. Simply based on supply chains, on how the dollars move through the economy, including what happens after the steel is produced, just a very fast screening exercise. So now let's say we get these numbers and we establish the selling of coal and iron ore is material to our exposure. Let's dig into this. Let's see if we can do a site-specific assessment or whether we have to do an average data assessment. And the materiality threshold is again a step where you have to answer several questions. So, for example, and there's no guidelines. There's no guidelines in terms of how you do it, but you have to justify why you made those decisions and then stick by them. So, for example, it's like it could be the magnitude of emissions. It could be your ability to influence the outcome. So that's maybe a really good segue to the question I was just asked. Like, there is no ability to influence what the users or what the final consumers do with the IT supplies. Maybe there's just nothing you can do, and so why dig into it? Because there's literally no lever that we have to influence that. Then we have financial spend or financial revenue in this case, stakeholder concern, business risk exposure. Those kinds of things can be assessed depending on what on where the focus should be placed. Let's determine our calculation method. So for us, I put this blurb at the bottom there because I thought it was really interesting from the guidelines. I'm going to read it out. Companies should choose a calculation method based on their business goals and their ability to collect data from processing of sold intermediate products by third parties. In many cases, collecting primary data from downstream value chain partners may be difficult. In such cases, companies should use the average data method. I think you will probably find that, especially as you embark on the journey, this will be true for 90 to 95% of your cases. You will probably use the average data method to get started. So let's do it. Step 4. So in physical quantities, I just collected some data. So we sold physical quantities, 1 million tons of coal and 1.6 million tons of iron ore. Our carbon intensity is approximately 750 kilos of CO2e per ton of metallurgical coal. Iron ore does not carry carbon intensity because it doesn't get combusted. That means the total emissions from combusting the coal is approximately 750 kilotons and none from iron ore. This is just the numbers. How should we allocate this? Should we really allocate all the emissions to coal, or should we allocate the emissions and split them between coal and iron ore? So I had to look at the Scope 3 standard, Chapter 8, allocation, and the allocation method says, depends, as so often in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it says, go for physical quantities first. If you can't get to them, use the economic ones. So the screening method used the economic ones. Now we're moving into physical. Again, for the physical methods, there's 2 ways that are suggested. One is the energy allocation method. And so the way that is interpreted is, what is the calorific value of the process that comes from coal and iron ore? And according to that energy allocation method, which is the 4th line here, is all the emissions sit with coal. From a mass allocation method, the emissions move more towards coal than, I think it's actually the wrong way around. Oh no, like from a mass allocation method, the emissions sit more with the coal than with the iron ore, and from an economic allocation, it's the other way around. Because from the economic allocation, I think I might have gotten the mass allocation wrong. From an economic allocation, you spend less money on coal and more on iron ore, so the emissions should shift more towards iron ore. Then I compared that between the screening and the inventory methods, and you can see here that the screening method gives you the right direction, but the average data method actually gives you more insight into what's actually going on. Question is now, which method's the right one? The answer is, it depends. It depends on how much data you can get your hands on and how the materiality threshold was set. But this is essentially the process. And this gets much easier if the screening works well. If the screening works well, then you've made like a fantastic start, and you know exactly where you should put your efforts. If the screening is not working well, you will spend probably a lot of time on actually understanding what's going on and where the big emissions parcels are. And by the time you get to the inventory stage, time's already up and the next reporting period has started. So it's similar to the upstream emissions. It's like an efficient screening method is worth its weight in gold. And then we refine over time. I don't want to go through this. So I put together a few takeaways. There's so many takeaways, but I put a few together, and I believe we might be sharing the slide deck afterwards. We don't have to read through all of these, but like I said, screening is key. Data collection is dependent. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made along the way, but there's a pretty clear guideline there's a pretty clear guideline what decisions have to be made and what has to happen after those decisions. But everything comes down to, let's screen efficiently so we know where we should put our efforts. The good news is there's upstream concepts that we're used to that can be adopted to downstream. And then the last point is some downstream categories are simply not revenue chain categories. They need their own assessment. They have their own thinking, and we're going to run another webinar on that if you're interested. To bring it around to fair supply, so the data sets that we run under our hood are exactly fit for purpose from what I just talked about over the last hour. So we're very powerful solutions for upstream and downstream screening and taking you further along the journey to get there. The source data sets and everything is in line with the methods that the greenhouse gas protocol prescribes, and the way the company data is embedded into those external data sets is exactly along the guidelines that the greenhouse gas protocol describes. And there's a lot of steps that can be automated, and we're working on a lot of solutions here to essentially take the nitty-gritty stuff away from our customers and really enable customers for their to actually act on what they find. So you don't spend your time, trying to get the right data sources or like deciding on the right calculation methods. There's a lot of support we can offer in order to, especially at the stage where we are at now, where scope 3 screening is kind of the first cap of the rank. There's a lot that we can offer. We also have a scope 1, scope 2 calculator in our platform. That this is of course a much more mature area, scope 1 and 2, that hooks in with the scope 3 screening tool that we have. If you want to have a look at that, we've got a QR code here, but there will also be, we'll be in touch after this webinar. I think I might be finishing up bang on time. Yes. And then we have a future webinar suggestions we would love to see. If there's interest in maybe having a similar deep dive session into investments, because they have additional concepts. You might have heard of the PCAF protocol or the PCAF guidelines, which essentially are the bridge between what does a dollar investment mean in terms of spend, because spending $1 on a company and investing $1 in a company have completely different effects on the carbon exposure. And so digging into that is something that we wanted to offer. We just want to gauge what the interest is for that. I need input from my crew here. Can I go one slide further? No, I'm left in the dark. I don't know. Cool. Q&A. We don't have much time left. I'm so sorry. We went a little bit over time, almost. It's 1 minute left, I think. I'll see if there's a few more questions in the chat. Otherwise, I'm really sorry. Thanks, KLC. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Maybe I can. I'm going to answer a few more. You can drop off if you like, but I will see if I can answer a few more here. And you asked, invested in a commercial building, scope 3 finance emissions for the investor. Does that get double counted for the manager operator of the building emissions firm? It does, yeah. And the greenhouse gas protocol wants you to. It's always the question, what does double counting look like? When you look at any kind of supplier emissions, like for example, if you say you fill up your car with petrol at the petrol station, the production of the petrol costs emissions at the refinery. And so those emissions are in your scope 3 and also in the refinery's scope 1. And the greenhouse gas protocol says that's fine. There's certain double counting you're not allowed to do, but that's kind of where sort of companies sit in each other's value chains, that is allowed. And the reason, there's two schools of thought, and I love this. So there's two schools of thought around this. Either you can say, that's great, because if the same companies, if two companies report on the same emissions, then both of them will try to mitigate those emissions and will make the world a better place. That's awesome, because then we have two companies working on reducing the same emissions parcel, and that's going to have more chance of success. And then there's the negative school of thought that says, yeah, but if they actually succeed, then they're both going to claim the success. And then they will both say, hey, we reduced our emissions by 10 kilotons, and they both then report 10 kilotons, and everyone thinks the overall emissions reduction is 20 kilotons, where in fact it was only 10. So there's two schools of thought, but yes, that's what's happening. Enabled emissions, Peter Dan. If we think of concrete sold to construction customers to build a bridge, does the use of that concrete in the bridge generate scope 3 category 11 because the bridge enables emissions from the vehicles used by the bridge? Is that the correct understanding? Yes, it is. It is. It depends on if you. This is one way of how it can be. It can be assessed. Yeah, it's one way of how it can be viewed. Again, the greenhouse gas protocol is a little bit shady when it comes to that, but it does say every subsequent step in the production line should be considered. It's the same when you construct a building. Constructing the building enables use of that building, which enables electricity use, which causes emissions. It's like it's a never-ending flywheel. That's why screening is so important, because then you understand, like, do I actually want this or not? There's a whole, the same with home loans. There's a whole like question around if a bank finances a house and somebody lives in it for 50 years, how much of the emissions caused by living in that house is linked to the financed emissions of the bank and stuff. So there's a lot of concepts like that. I think that's the last one. I'm not sure if even Salomon's still here. Thank you very much for joining. I'm really pleased that so many people made time to come here. I think there were quite a few people here. So I'll see you next time, and I wish you all a good weekend. Thank you very much.